Westmoreland Chapel, February 7th, 1993.
Mark chapter 13. I wonder if anybody can tell me what this chapter is called. There's a famous name for it. Who said that? Very good. The Olivet Discourse. And that's in a couple of other places in the Gospel, Matthew 24 and Luke 21. But this is the Lord's famous discussion of the second coming, or at least part of it. And so this is a very important section, as all of God's Word is, but this has a special relevance to us right now, I feel. And as we read it here, I think I have it divided up into two parts. First part is the questions of the disciples, verses 1 through 4. And then the last part is exhortations in view of things to come. Now, one of the things that struck me as I was studying this section this time was the fact that the Lord tells us about these things with a view to exhorting us to doing something about it. And so and then under exhortations, there's several sections. First of all, verses 5 and 6, false messiahs are coming, therefore watch out for them, that they don't deceive you. And then verses 7 and 8, wars, earthquakes, famines, and other troubles are coming. And then the exhortation connected with that is, do not be troubled, the end is not yet. And then the third thing under this is, persecution of God's people is coming. Watch out for yourselves. And then the fourth thing is the great tribulation. You might even call it the greatest tribulation is coming, because, of course, Christian history has been full of tribulations, but this is the granddaddy of them all. And the exhortation connected with that is flee. Just one word, flee. It's going to be so terrible, there's just one thing to do. Get out of there as fast as you can. Get away. And then finally, the Lord's coming is coming also. And the exhortations for that are, take heed, watch and pray, and watch. All right, let's go back now to the first section here. The questions of the disciples, verses 1 to 4. Let's look at that. There were present at that season some who told him about... I got the wrong. I got Luke 13 here. Okay, Mark 13th. Then as he went out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, Teacher, see what manner of stones and what buildings are here. And Jesus answered and said to him, Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone shall be left upon another that shall not be thrown down. Now as he sat on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter, James, John, and Andrew asked him privately, Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign when all of these things will be fulfilled? And then I think it's well for us to understand from Matthew 24, verse 3, they also ask him, What shall be the sign of thy coming and of the end of the age? So Jesus, in this chapter, is answering those questions. But I want you to notice the first couple of verses here in connection with the context that they're in. Now remember, Jesus had come into Jerusalem, and the first thing he did was go to the temple and look around, it says, about on all things. Then the next day, he comes into the temple again, and on the way, he curses the fig tree, which is a symbol of Israel, and says, "Let no fruit ever grow on you again." And then he goes into the temple and he cleanses the temple with great power and great violence, you might say. And he says to them, "Make not my Father's house a house of merchandise." And he said, "This is my Father's house, is to be a house of prayer, but you make it a den of thieves." And then the next day he gets into conflict with the religious leaders, and he ends up that by giving the greatest denunciation in the entire Bible, Matthew 23. If you can find a greater denunciation and greater curses, and even the threat of hell, he says, "How shall you escape the condemnation of hell?" That's what he told the religious leaders of Israel. That is the most withering judgment that anybody in the whole Bible pronounces. And then at the end of that, he weeps over Jerusalem and says, "Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, how often I would have taken you under my wings like a hen takes its chickens under his wing, or her wings, and ye would not." Then he says, "Henceforth your house is left unto you desolate." Now notice, just a few days before he was saying, "My Father's house," concerning the temple. Now he says, "It's your house." It's not my Father's anymore, because it doesn't have the presence of God in it anymore. God's presence has left. Just think, sometime, actually, it was at that point right there that God's presence left, when Jesus, the Son of God, left the house of God in Jerusalem. It was left desolate. It lasted 40 more years while God was testing the Jews for 40 years, and then it was destroyed. But the disciples heard all of this. And that, by the way, that temple was one of the great wonders of the world, I think probably of all time. Do you realize what a tremendous building that was? It was started in about 19 BC by King Herod. Herod was a great builder, and he built that temple up, and it actually the main part of it was built up in just a couple of years, and consequently, by the time Jesus was born, it was a magnificent place. But they were still working on it when Jesus was 30 years old and started his ministry. You remember, they said to him when he said, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." And they said, "This temple has been being built for 46 years. They had been working on it. And actually, they didn't finish it until 63, I think, AD. That would be just 7 years before it was destroyed. It was completed. But anyway, at that time, it was a magnificent structure, and it was made out of white limestone, huge blocks. And they say that when you came around the corner came over the top of the Mount of Olives, suddenly, it was just right upon you. You looked at that temple, like this huge structure, shimmering brightly in the white stones, shimmering in the bright sunlight, and it was just a magnificent thing to look upon. And now that's where they were, you see. And as they were going up the Mount of Olives, after Jesus' denunciation, then the disciples, you can see, what was he saying? This meant everything. This temple meant everything to all the Jews. What is he saying? They could tell that his attitude toward the temple was terrible, and that it had changed drastically. And so they call his attention to the magnificence of this temple. Lord, you can't mean that. That's really underlying what they're saying here. This is a magnificent temple. Look how beautiful it is. Look how great it is. By the way, the temple structure took up as much room as 35 football fields. Just think of that. 35 football fields, a huge structure. And the greatest part of it, of course, was the court of the Gentiles, and Herod had expended most of his effort on that because he was a Gentile too. And it was paved with all different colors of marble, the court of the Gentiles was. So you can imagine 35 football fields. That's a tremendous thing. But anyway, you can see behind the disciples' request here and behind their request for him to look at the magnificence of the temple. And then his immediate answer is, it's going to be torn down from stone to stone. There will not be a stone left. And it came to me that all of the works of man are magnificent, aren't they? But the trouble is, they've got sin in them. And they're all going to be destroyed. All of the works of sinful man are going to be destroyed, just like this temple was destroyed. And the reason they're going to be destroyed, Jesus told us, and that is, that temple didn't fulfill its purpose. The purpose for which it was made was to bring people into contact with God. Jesus said it's a house of prayer. And what do? You make it a den of thieves. You just go in to steal what you can to get for yourself. Just a whole bunch of selfishness. Just the selfish nature of man coming out. The temple of God is used for that. And you see, all of God's gifts have been given to us to use for bringing people into contact with Him, because that's what we're made for. That's what all mankind is made for, is to fellowship with His Creator. Made in His image so He can do that. And you see, man has taken all these gifts that God has given and used them for his own selfish purposes, just like the temple was. And so God says it's all going to be torn down. I'm not going to have any of it continuing in my world. And so they ask questions. The big question that they ask is when? When is all this going to take place, Lord? When's the temple going to be torn down? When are you coming? When is coming the end of the age? And then another special question was, what will be the sign when? What is the big sign that this is going to immediately follow? Your coming especially is immediately following. Well, actually, and also, what is the big sign that the temple's going to be torn down? So those two things are in view. And as with so much prophecy, brothers and sisters, you have to realize that they're both in view here. And they're, as people have expressed it so often, and yet I don't know a better illustration, and that is that it's like two mountain peaks. You see one of them is taller than the other one, and it's further away, but they look like they're right next to each other from a distance. But you get up there, you get up to the mountains, and you find out there's a huge distance between the two. And that's the way it is with so much prophecy. So much prophecy has more than one thing in view. It has a near fulfillment and a far fulfillment. And that's what you find here. And many of the features of the near fulfillment are true also of the far fulfillment. Many of the features of the destruction of Jerusalem surrounding it are also true of the second coming of Christ. And that's why it's a little bit difficult sometimes to distinguish one from the other, or to just get the whole thing straightened out. But there's another thing about prophecy that I think we should take into consideration, and that is prophecy is purposely not completely clear. And that is that we've got a great enemy. God's got a great enemy out there, and he would take advantage of clear prophecy. You see, he wasn't even able to figure out from prophecy that Christ was coming to die for the sins of the men, of people. Neither was Israel able to figure it out. Now, if he had, you remember it says about him, they wouldn't, Paul says about the demons and the great powers of Satan, that they wouldn't have crucified him if they'd known that. They wouldn't want to cooperate with him. And so they would not have been brought into... You see, God uses the devil all the time. He uses the demons. He uses the wicked men. He's so clever. He's so absolutely... His wisdom is so great that he just ties them in knots and makes them be his servants. And that's what he's... I think today we can see that too. All right, so we see both things in view here. Now let's go to the first things that we see in view here. Verses 5 and 6. And Jesus answering them began to say, Take heed that no one deceives you, for many will come in my name, saying, I am he, and will deceive many. All right, now, I want you to notice this word, take heed, because it's repeated over and over again, and it's actually translated in different ways. It's the Greek word blepo. And it actually, I'll tell you how it's translated in the King James Version. 90 times it's translated see, S-E-E. 10 times it's translated behold. 12 times it's translated take heed. And 7 times beware. Now it's used in this chapter, it's translated see in verse 2. Notice verse 2, and Jesus said, Do you see these great buildings? The same word translated take heed. And then it's translated take heed in verse 5. Take heed no one deceives you. And in verse 23, where it's he says, But take heed, see, I have told you all things beforehand. And then in verse 33, take heed again. And then in verse 9, it's translated, watch out. Verse 9, but watch out for yourselves. Now, so you can see the basic word is see. In other words, you could say, in our slang, sometimes we say, keep your eyes open. In other words, be alert. Watch out, beware. Now that's what Jesus is saying all the way through this. Keep your eyes open. Don't go to sleep. In fact, that's another word he uses that we're going to see later. So this is the constant exhortation for us to do. And that's a very appropriate thing for us, I think, brothers and sisters, to realize that in this day we need to be especially alert and keep our eyes open for what's happening all around us. And Jesus emphasizes that in connection with His second coming. Now, another thing is that there's going to be signs of the devil's work increasingly, and they're going to get worse and worse and worse, and consequently, the two great signs of the devil's work are what? What are the two great things that Jesus said the devil was the father of? Well, yeah, that's true, pride. And that's going to come to a head too. Lies, that's right. You see it right here, you see. Take heed that no one deceive you. And what's the other thing? Murder. And there's going to be increasing lies, increasing deception, increasing violence, increasing murder and killing. And it's going to, well, let's look at the next part here, because that leads us right into the second thing that we're going to look at. Verses 7 and 8. And when you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be troubled, for such things must happen, that the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be earthquakes in various places, and there will be famines and troubles. These are the beginnings of sorrows. Now I want you to notice that word sorrows, because it's a very suggestive word. It's the word travail. It's the word birth pangs. And that is a marvelous key to this whole passage. The beginning of birth pangs. He says, when you see wars, when you see all this killing begin, don't worry, it's not yet. It's going to get worse and worse and worse and worse, just like travail gets worse. Now, my dear wife and I went through this 5 times. I very vividly remember the terrible ordeal of travail, because even though she suffered the travail, actually I was suffering in sympathy with her, and every time I thought, isn't this ever going to get over with? And it's just getting worse and worse, and we get closer and closer together. That's another thing I think is significant. The pains got closer and closer together. And we've got a picture at home of our first baby just after the birth. We got a picture of June and me and the baby, and of the three, I looked the worst of all. Oh dear, I never want to go through a thing like that again. And anyway, that's what it all amounts to here, you see. Now, I want you to notice that this is a scriptural thing, because look at Romans 8:18. Keep your hand in Mark and look it over at Romans 8:18.